Rising temperatures, melting ice caps, extreme weather. The climate crisis is no longer a distant threat. It's unfolding before our very eyes. But how did we get here? How and when did humanity first realize the impact of its actions on the planet? And where do we go from here? From early scientific discoveries to global protests and policy changes, this is the story of climate change awareness, how we woke up to an existential challenge. Our understanding of climate change began in the 19th century. In 1824, Joseph Fourier, a French mathematician, first proposed the concept of the greenhouse effect, suggesting that Earth's atmosphere traps heat like a glass house. This idea was further expanded in 1896 when Swedish scientist Svante Arrhenius calculated that burning fossil fuels like coal would lead to an increase in Earth's temperature. At the time, his findings were theoretical, but they would later prove to be disturbingly accurate. As the Industrial Revolution accelerated, the combustion of coal, oil, and gas became widespread. Despite Fourier and Arrhenius' early warnings, climate science was still primitive, and few realized the long-term consequences of increasing atmospheric carbon dioxide, CO2, levels. However, these foundational studies would pave the way for future climate research. The early 20th century saw an explosion in industrial activity. Cities expanded, and fossil fuels powered the world's growing economy. In 1938, scientist Guy Callendar observed a steady rise in global temperatures and linked it to CO2 emissions, now widely accepted as the theory of global warming. However, few people took the warning seriously. Climate science was still in its infancy, and economic growth took priority. By the 1950s, coal-powered factories and automobiles were spewing millions of tons of CO2 into the air, resulting in air pollution in major cities like London and Los Angeles, leading to health crises, forcing governments to begin enacting pollution regulations. These were the first instances of environmental policy being shaped by industrial activity, though climate change itself was not yet widely recognized as an issue. In 1958, scientist Charles David Keeling began measuring atmospheric CO2 at the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii. The results were groundbreaking. His data showed a clear year-over-year rise in CO2 levels. This trend, now known as the Keeling curve, provided the first concrete evidence that human activities were altering the Earth's atmosphere. Keeling's research became a cornerstone of modern climate science. His precise measurements allowed future scientists to track CO2 trends over decades, proving beyond doubt that human activity was driving atmospheric changes. However, despite growing concerns among scientists, climate change remained a niche topic with little public or political attention. The world carried on, business as usual. The 1970s marked the first major wave of environmental activism. April 22, 1970, the world saw the first ever Earth Day, where 20 million Americans took to the streets demanding action on pollution and environmental destruction. Scientists warned that increasing CO2 levels could lead to a greenhouse effect, but focus at the time was more on air and water pollution than global warming. The decade saw the establishment of the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency in the US, and the passage of key environmental laws like the Clean Air Act. While these policies targeted pollution, they laid the groundwork for later climate regulations. Meanwhile, research reports from groups like the National Academy of Sciences were beginning to highlight the long-term dangers of fossil fuel emissions. One of the most influential environmental groups to emerge from the activism of the 1970s was Greenpeace. Founded in 1971 by a small group of activists in Vancouver, Canada, Greenpeace quickly grew into an international movement dedicated to protecting the environment and raising awareness about climate change, pollution, and biodiversity loss. During the 1980s, Greenpeace was instrumental in exposing industrial pollution, advocating for renewable energy, and pressuring governments to take action on climate change. Their direct action tactics, such as intercepting whaling ships and protesting nuclear testing, drew widespread attention to environmental issues and helped shape the modern climate movement. Today, Greenpeace remains a vocal advocate for urgent climate policies and sustainable development. By the 1980s, the warnings grew louder. In 1988, NASA scientist James Hansen testified before US Congress, stating that the evidence of global warming was clear and compelling. This led to the formation of the IPCC Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in 1988, marking the first time governments formally acknowledged climate change as a global issue. Scientific models improved dramatically during this period, making future climate predictions more precise. Researchers warned of melting glaciers, rising sea levels, and more extreme weather events. Yet, despite these findings, meaningful action remained slow as fossil fuel industries exerted political influence to downplay the crisis. While scientists were raising alarms about climate change, some of the world's most powerful industries pushed back. In the 1980s and the 1990s, oil and gas companies like ExxonMobil funded research to cast doubt on climate science, despite internal documents proving they knew about the dangers of fossil fuel emissions. This era saw the birth of climate denial, which delayed meaningful policy action for decades. The 1990s saw the first major international effort to tackle climate change. In 1997, the Kyoto Protocol was signed, committing industrialized nations to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. However, the United States refused to ratify the treaty, arguing it would harm economic growth. It later withdrew its signature. Meanwhile, CO2 emissions continued to rise. The 2000s saw increasing climate activism, with organizations like Greenpeace and the Sierra Club pushing for stronger action. Despite growing awareness, countries struggled to balance economic interests with environmental responsibility, leading to continued policy delays. As the climate crisis accelerated, extreme weather events became more frequent and destructive. Severe thunderstorms, flooding, snowfall, and record-breaking hurricanes like Katrina in 2005 devastated communities, while wildfires in California, Australia, and the Amazon burned millions of acres. Scientists linked these early disasters to climate change, but still, political action remained slow. Climate change awareness took center stage in 2006 when former US Vice President Al Gore released the documentary An Inconvenient Truth. The film won an Academy Award and brought the science of climate change into the mainstream, sparking debates worldwide. Gore also co-founded a fund management firm that invests in environment-friendly portfolios and is involved with other climate change campaigns. He really pushed the message. But while awareness increased, real policy changes still remained stagnant. On December 12, 2015, nearly 200 nations signed the Paris Agreement, committing to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. However, even as world leaders made pledges, emissions continued rising. This led to the youth climate movement, led by activists like Greta Thunberg. Early protests like School Strike for Climate on August 20th, 2018 saw her solo protest. This inspired a global movement that mobilized hundreds of thousands of young people, all demanding immediate action. In recent years, climate activism has taken on new urgency, with groups like Just Stop Oil emerging to demand immediate action on fossil fuels. Founded in 2022, Just Stop Oil has gained international attention for its high-profile protests, including blocking major roads, disrupting sporting events, and staging sit-ins at government buildings. Their goal is simple: to pressure governments to halt new fossil fuel extraction projects and transition rapidly to renewable energy. While controversial, their tactics have sparked widespread debate about the effectiveness of civil disobedience in pushing climate policies forward. Whether seen as heroes or disruptors, Just Stop Oil represents the growing frustration among young activists who believe that traditional political processes are failing to address the climate emergency. Today, we are living the consequences of a changing climate. Wildfires, hurricanes, rising sea levels, and record-breaking heat waves. The fight against climate change is far from over. With advancements in renewable energy, battery storage, and carbon capture, there is hope for a more sustainable future. However, the world faces a crucial decision: continue business as usual, or make the bold changes necessary to protect future generations. And, as scientists warn that we have a narrow window to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, the question remains: will humanity act before it's too late? The story of climate change awareness is still being written. The future is in our hands. What do you think is the next big step in fighting climate change? Or are we too late? Please don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into history, culture, and the most pressing issues of our time.